Andreas, that was a great presentation to this great audience. I've got some follow-up questions for you on CTE programs in particular. There's a lot of interest in the United States around better linking education to high opportunity jobs and careers. What have we learned from across the world about effective CTE programs and links between education and work?
It's really about integrating the world of learning and the world of work much more closely. And you can start with this in primary school. Often disadvantaged children have no idea why they should study math and science because they do not know the occupations that relate to them. So giving children early on exposure to how what they learn in school is actually relevant and useful in real terms is a very important start. But then, later in schools, middle school, high school, giving students work-based experiences actually where they can acquire different skill sets. And we shouldn't, high-performing systems don't regard CET as just necessarily oriented towards occupations, but it's a different way of learning. It's a way of there's often a strong focus on transversal skills. There is a strong focus on high-quality work-based learning. In fact, successful CET, the biggest differentiator is really the quality work-based learning.
That's very interesting. So sometimes we have CT programs that are segmented programs in a school or on a particular job, but you're saying that even more effective is trying to integrate that work-based learning and transferable skills related to work across the school?
Yeah, I think it's a risk if CET becomes a one-way road towards a specific class of occupation as opposed to becoming a way of thinking, way of working, and way of learning in school that opens up opportunities. It's also important to very closely integrate CET and academic pathways. I think that's also what we see in high-performing systems. That in Switzerland, for example, you can become a car mechanic, and later on, if you want to become an engineer, there's going to be ways back. So these worlds are very closely integrated, and even the work-based component has a very strong emphasis on transversal skills.
And when you look at the transferable skills, what have we learned about the most important transferable skills in that context in terms of preparing someone for work across occupations?
Well, the work-based learning is a fantastic environment to develop social skills. You work with real problems and real people. What you do has actually stakes. If you make a mistake, it has consequences, which in schooling is often very contrived and artificial in learning. So that is a great way to develop real-life skills. Also, creativity. You develop new ideas, new things. You can try out things. The workplace is a great place of learning, actually.
And you've mentioned the role of employer engagement and leadership. Could you talk about where you see good examples of employers really engaging and what makes that possible in an effective way?
Well, the models for that are countries like Switzerland, Germany, Austria that have a long tradition of employers being deeply engaged, not just in the delivery of career and technical education, but also in the design of the systems. They will work very closely with the public school systems to develop kind of smooth transitions and pathways. And you'd spend part of your week in the workplace, part of your week in the school, and employers actually are active contributors to the design and then the delivery. In my country, in Germany, actually, it's the majority of young people who choose to go that route rather than the academic route because the learning is so much more interesting and actually often of higher quality. The kind of quality provision by employers is very strong. That's hard to emulate because it really is about having the culture and the institutions of employers feeling responsible for education as a provider, as a designer of education. But there are countries that have more recently moved into this. You go to Singapore, the CETs, the ITEs in Singapore are good examples. You go to Norway, you go to Denmark, they have actually developed that culture and openness of the system. So I think those are probably the countries most interesting to look at when you think about the transition. How do you actually get employers on board?
Let me briefly get specific in each of those, in 2 or 3 of those countries. Singapore, you've mentioned the ITEs. Tell us about the ITEs in Singapore. What's happened there? How fast, and what have we learned from that?
Singapore is an interesting case. Career and technical education used to be the last option for children who had no other option. Nobody would have voluntarily opted for that path. And they decided to change this because it was, there was a clear labor market demand for those kinds of skills. The first thing they did is they gave the ITEs the same amount of money than universities would get. They actually upgraded the kind of quality of institutions, and while universities are very good in siphoning off a lot of that money to research, actually here it ended up in education and teaching. So they built first-grade facilities, they hired first-grade staff, they built good relationship with employers, because you want to have your best plumber to become a teacher, not a plumber. So they were very, very good in that. And they also, the ITEs have become not about, low-skilled profession, but even very advanced careers, banking and I think this is a very interesting model. The institutions have now a very good reputation. They are now the first choice for young people. The Kosen Institute in Japan is another example, also designed in the 50s, 60s, when the system couldn't cater for certain types of children. Today, they are one of the most prestigious educational institutions, offering project-based, immersive, work-based led learning environments that actually are very interesting for students and very effective.
Singapore, the ITE institutions, how fast has that happened in Singapore? And are those new institutions, or are those changes of existing institutions and programs?
They're actually very existing institutions, but they have completely been remodeled over the last 10 years. Really.
And Switzerland and Germany, you talked about the role that employers play. One of the things you'd said previously is that one of the issues is that you can't just have one employer do this. It's got to be employers working together and institutions working together to bring employers in more generally. Can you describe a little bit of that? Like, why can't one employer just solve this, and what's needed to help employers work together on this?
Yeah, large employers can solve this, and they often do, but most of your economy is small and medium-sized enterprises, and for them it's actually very hard to provide the kind of infrastructure. In Switzerland, for example, companies share apprentices. An apprentice may work with one company and another company, and they also, small and medium-sized enterprises may have institutions or organizations that help them build the facilities, that work on quality assurance. For big employers, I agree, it's easy to do, but actually the bulk of the economy are sort of so granular that actually they need some institutions and mechanisms to build the infrastructure to do that well.
There's an effort in Switzerland and Germany for employers to work together to define more specifically what's needed in order to give more guidance to the education system. How does that work?
Absolutely. That's where it starts, actually. Employers are very actively invested in curriculum design, in development, even in the regular school system. In the United States, when you think about Common Core or school standards, they're mainly developed by academics. In Europe, you'd have almost the whole of society represented in that effort, thinking about what students should learn, how that should be developed, and clearly the voice of employers is very important. And that design part is important, and then also the setting standards, developing the learning environments. Those things are very much present.
And just concretely, how does that get done? I mean, people are busy, they've got their day jobs, working hard. Are there institutions that are set up that would help bring them that collaboration
Yeah,
into
the
being?
government is a facilitator of that process, but it's actually of intrinsic interest to employers. Employers derive huge benefits from that. They are not necessarily direct financial benefits, sort of apprentices making money, but you have much smoother school work transitions, you have much better integration into the workplace. You create a kind of knowledge, sort of employers know who they're going to work with, so those advantages make that a very worthwhile investment for employers.
Let me ask, separate from CTE and linking education to work, you talked in the presentation about places like Vietnam where high-performing schools are getting resources to help others. How does that work concretely, really specifically? What do they do, what do they get, and how does that have an impact?
Yeah, actually the pairing of high and low-performing schools is something that we find actually in many countries. It's very popular in Asia, Vietnam, parts of China. Basically the way this works is if you are a high-performing institutions, you get more resources, more money to hire more expertise, to build more expertise, but you will not deploy that expertise in your own school, but you'll actually allocate that expertise to support a low-performing school. For example, your vice principal, great principal, would actually become the support of the school principal in a low-performing school, and they can take some teachers with you, become advisors of the teachers there. So it's not actually financial flows directly, but it's more about building a kind of network for knowledge mobilization and sharing, and that would last for a couple of years, sometimes longer, to build strong partnerships so that the teachers in low-performing schools have access to high-quality practice and also high-quality leadership, really.
So it's interesting, it's not actually a performance reward that does this, it's resources that make possible the human expertise to help other schools.
Yeah, of course, the motivation for teachers to support the low-performing schools is that it's a career elevator. Basically, the big benefit for you as a teacher to support a low-performing school is that you rise in status.
Yeah.
Most of these countries have very differentiated teacher careers. You start as a novice teacher, then you become a mentor, and you may, at the end of your career, be called a professor. That really means you are seen as the educator of the educators, and you get a very, very high. It's more about, rewarding people for collaborating, for sharing, and recognizing them for that.
So to become a professor, you don't leave K through 12 to a college.
Exactly.
You get to be a good professor, a K through 12 professor. How?
Yeah. Well, by being seen by your profession to be a great person in your role, and by having, for example, they would have networks of knowledge creation. If you share your lesson plans, models, and many other teachers use them as models, you're going to be seen by the profession. That will be something that your school principal will then recognize in elevating you in your career. There will be typically 3, 4, 5 stages in your career, and if you reach the top stage, you'll be a mentor to a lot of teachers. You'll be a kind of educator. You'll do model lessons. You'll spend, in a way, an American teacher spends most of the time teaching in the classroom. In these countries, teachers spend a significant share of their time working with other teachers to frame practice and expand capacity and build capacity in the system.
Last question on CTE. We draw to a close soon. You talked about Singapore, you've spoken about Switzerland and Germany, but you mentioned Denmark and Norway are countries that have made progress on CTE programs that might be even more easily translatable to the US than perhaps Germany, for example. What's happened in Denmark and Norway, and what can we learn from that here in the United States?
Yeah, Germany, Switzerland have a long established culture of employer engagement that is probably hard to emulate. Historically grown. Countries like Denmark and Norway have more recently established pathways through in the career and technical sector. They've also been doing well in engaging employers, creating institutions and frameworks that even small enterprises can contribute, can participate, can access those kinds of networks. And I think that's something that I do think is relevant for the United States, to build sort of the government focusing more on become a kind of regulator and providing the institutions. And that's more important than financial incentives. I'm not a great fan, countries like France do that through taxation. If you're not providing work-based learning, you're going to pay some fines or higher taxes and so on. And I don't think that's the way this really works. It's more about providing positive incentives, frameworks, networks, so that employers can plug into that and work with apprentices and offer work-based learning.
So when you say just really concretely, frameworks or institutions that make it easier for employers to do that, what's an example of that in Denmark or in Norway, where a specific type of new institution or something makes it easier for employers to do this work?
Well, the first thing is, how do you establish an apprenticeship? How do you build a curriculum for this? How do you want that the people at the workplace have some level of pedagogical skills so that they can actually work with young people and so on. And that providing that training, that's where it starts. But also, what do you do about quality assurance? How do you know it works? What do you know about insurance? There are lots of kind of issues that are involved where small and medium employers really need to draw on resources and expertise. Without that, and then sharing apprentices. You may have a small enterprise where you cannot actually sustain a single apprentice, and where I think this is very important.
And who does that? We should close in a minute, but if people are thinking concretely, I'd love to be able to emulate this. They can learn more, but who does that work? That's some real work to organize all that you described in terms of the support for apprenticeship curriculum or bringing employers together in this way. Who does that work in Denmark? Is it the school system? Is it a new kind of intermediary organization? Who does that work?
In the case of Germany and Switzerland, it's employer organizations. In the case of Denmark and Norway, it's actually the government that has established those kinds of intermediaries. But they're very effective, and it's actually much less of a kind of financial investment than the kind of heavy institutions that we often provide. The worst thing you can do is basically try to emulate a contrived work-based environment in an institution. It's always going to be outdated. It's always going to work with people who don't have the labor market expertise. It's very hard to provide high-quality CET in public institutions.
So the work-based learning in an employer in a high-quality way may be the most important single factor here.
I think the public institutions can do what they do best, is focusing on high-level academic skills that you also need for a work-based, for a CET. CET is, again, it should not be about practical skills alone. There are many occupations, if you think the banking sector, it's a good example where actually CET is a very effective way to develop those kinds of knowledge, skills, and attitudes, but it needs a kind of academic component and a work-based component. So I think that's where the public institutions do well, but when it comes to acquiring really the kind of qualities that make you successful at the workplace, it's very important to draw on the people who know that best, and those are employers.
Andreas, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jon.
Always a pleasure.